Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Brodell. I'm our Business and Political Engagement Manager at PeopleForBikes. I run our webinar series. I have with me today Alex Logeman, who's going to run you through some tariff updates and key actions that you can take on your business side to help fend off the effects of those tariffs on your business. So with that, I will hand it over to Alex.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric, and thanks for everyone for tuning in today. Excited to give you an update on where things stand in the tariff world and talk about more than just tariffs on Chinese goods. So we'll cover a pretty wide swath of issues here. I'll go ahead and do some quick introductions in just a second for those of you who don't know who I am. Then we'll go through the Section 301 tariffs, which are the tariffs applied to imported goods from China. We'll talk about the Miscellaneous Tariffs Bill, which is another upcoming opportunity to provide some potential tariff relief. We'll talk about the EU cassette tariff litigation, where our industry was able to avoid some new tariffs on our goods. We'll talk about the recently passed Japan-US trade agreement, which will provide tariff relief for bicycle products imported to the US from Japan. And then at the end, cover a few actions you can take if you're interested in thinking about ways that your business can mitigate your tariff burden, and take Q&A at the end. So pretty packed agenda and don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. Just a brief introduction for who I am. My name is Alex Logeman, and I am policy counsel here at PeopleForBikes. I've been with PeopleForBikes for about 5 years and used to run our state and local policy work, but have switched over into a little bit broader role where, especially currently with all the tariff activity, I spend a very significant amount of my time working on tariff work and coordinating with our staff and lobbyists out in Washington, D.C. on those projects as well. So it's become a huge focal point of our policy work as an organization lately. Let's dive right into the substance, and the first issue I'd like to talk about is the Section 301 tariffs. We'll cover the timeline, sort of how we got to where we are today, what the final financial impact on the bike industry has been over the last little more than a year, cover the exclusion process overview, where some of our products have been excluded from the scope of these Section 301 tariffs, and then talk about what the prospects are for trade war resolution. And maybe resolution is a little bit too strong of a word, mitigation or tempering perhaps of the trade war. So first off, a quick timeline of where these tariffs have gone over the last, a little more than a year, maybe 18 months. The first round was effective in July of 2018. It was a 25% tariff increase. And when I say 25%, I don't mean 25% of the existing rate. I mean 25 points over the existing rate. So if the tariff on a product was 5%, it increased to 30%. So the increases have been very significant as we've gone through this process, and highly punitive. This first round did not have a significant number of bicycle products included within it. It really only affected GPS units. In round two, that was went into effect in August 2018, again a 25% ad valorem tariff increase. And this was the first time that we really got hit as an industry. That round included the harmonized tariff schedule headings that e-bikes and electric bicycle motors are imported under into the United States. Round three was the big one where our industry really got hit. And it moved in stages. In September 2018, there was a 10% tariff increase. This was later bumped up to a 25% tariff increase. And this included all complete bicycles and probably about 70% or so of bike parts, maybe even more than that, and accessories as well. So a very significant portion of our import value was included in this third round. And just to give you a general idea of what this means practically, the tariff on a complete bicycle, most complete bicycles is 11%. There are a few categories that come in at 5.5%. Your 11% tariff was increased at 36% once this round three tariff went to its full increase in May 2019. So it's a very significant percentage of the import value that's effectively a new tax on that product. Moving more recently, bike products were also included in round 4A. This went into effect on September 1st, 2019, and it was only a 15% increase. This was around the time frame where we started seeing the US and the China having a little more dialogue, and the talks kind of got back on track. So, certainly there's potential that, given some recent rhetoric, that these could go up further, but fortunately, we didn't get hit with a full 25% increase in round 4A. This included bike helmets, lights, and then really all the remaining bike components that weren't included in round 3. So that would be things like shifters, derailleurs, wheels, stems, seat posts, complete wheels. For those of you who have some more familiarity with the harmonized tariff schedule, there's one heading that's kind of a miscellaneous tariff, a miscellaneous category for bike products that don't have their own specific heading. And that's where a lot of these goods fall. So like stems, seat posts, handlebars, they don't have individual lines in the harmonized tariff schedule. They just kind of fall in this miscellaneous bucket. And that was included in round 4A. Round 4B was previously announced, but has since been put on hold as the US and China continue their trade talks. Certainly there's a chance that this round might go away, but unfortunately that would not do anything useful for our industry, as we really have been hit by round 3 and round 4A, and unfortunately eliminating 4B really wouldn't provide us with any relief. So what have we been doing to combat the Section 301 tariffs? Each of these rounds has had a lot of administrative sort of procedural opportunities to engage in the process with live testimony, written testimony. There have been a lot of hearings in Washington, D.C. So we have had PeopleForBikes staff and also organized industry leaders and executives to come to these hearings, testify in live, explain the effect that tariffs have on our industry. Of course, we've also drafted detailed written testimony at every stage to outline what we think the impacts will be, what products are affected, what this really means. We've done a lot of public outreach to try and demonstrate to both the United States Trade Representative, that's USTR on there, and also members of Congress that these tariffs are having a really negative impact on our industry, and the majority effect that we'll experience is really price increases for a lot of our products that are imported from China. And then I'll talk about exclusion requests in a minute. There's a sort of after the fact opportunity to ask to have your goods excluded once it was included in one of these 4 rounds, or 5 rounds really, with 4 being broken up, of tariff increases. And it's been kind of an interesting process. And then, of course, we've been trying to make sure we provide resources to our members to help them sort of deal with this situation, think about how they can file exclusion requests for their specific companies or provide any other things they need. So if you think there's not something we're doing that you could benefit from, please let me know. My contact information will be at the end of this presentation. So what's the financial impact of all this? When you really look at the tariff increase rates, you're looking at a 4 to 10-fold increase in our tariff rates. You know, for example, some of our products have a tariff rate of 3 to 5%. When you're adding 25% on top of that, that's a huge multiple, almost 10-fold for something that has a 3% tariff rate to start with. And I really noted the complete bicycle example already. We're now looking at 36% from 11%. In context for what other products, imported goods, have in terms of their tariff, our tariffs are already very, very high to begin with, and particularly tariffs on complete bicycles at 11%. And it's particularly true for an industry that doesn't have a huge domestic manufacturing base, since we don't make a lot of complete bicycles in the U.S. Most industries are looking at an average tariff rate for their products of 2 to 3%. So we already face quite a high burden to begin with, and obviously this has added a lot to that. I went back and crunched the numbers of what it looks like from when the round 3 tariffs that hit most of our product went into effect in September 2018, and ran a full year's analysis up through the end of August 2018 to see what it looked like over the last year or so. And for what I could calculate, which is not perfect information, just given the way the harmonized tariff schedule headings work and the data we have for each category, I can't break out every product, unfortunately. But we've paid at least $125 million in additional taxes over the last 12 months. So that'll give you just an idea of what the financial impact is in terms of how much money we're paying. It really, in essence, taxes. This money goes into the general fund of the U.S. Treasury. So we're obviously contributing a lot more to the operations of the federal government as an industry. And honestly, that's a low number because I can't break down all the individual categories of our products and get data for them. In reality, it's certainly higher than that. Exclusion process. Sorry, that's bleeding down a little bit at the bottom of your screen, but as I noted before, with each round of tariff increases, an exclusion process has been created where the trade representative's office will consider whether to remove your product from these list of goods that are being subject to the Section 301 tariffs. The round 3 tariffs were really where we got hit the hardest, and our industry filed a really significant number of exclusion products that were listed on round 3. These moved through a 4-stage process where first each exclusion request is open for public comment. Then it undergoes a substantive review where they sort of analyze the factors they're looking at, and that would be what's the financial impact? Is there domestic production of the product? What's the harm that your industry is facing? What are the consequences of implementing the tariff for small businesses, for US consumers, for your company? All these different things will be reviewed in that stage 2. At stage 3, they review the application for administrability, which basically means can customs receive, open up a shipment that you have and identify the product. So have you described it in a way that a person is really going to easily be able to identify it? Customs does not like descriptions that focus on identical products but that might have a different use. So let's say you had like medical needles and you were trying to distinguish ones for animals versus human beings. You can't look at the needle and necessarily know that kind of distinction off the top of your head. It depends on another factor that you would need to know. That's in contrast to something that's purely observable, like a bicycle frame is an observable item. You don't need to know additional information about it. So that's what they're looking for at that stage. And then at stage 4, it's pretty much a formality at that point. If it gets to stage 4, they're just finalizing the application internally and will likely publish it as an exclusion. So the vast majority of these products are at stage 3 of the process, meaning they're still undergoing substantive review. We don't have a great handle on whether they might advance. There are 2 goods that have now advanced to round 3, and these are city cruiser bikes and single speed bikes. So those ones are looking promising. We're not sure whether they'll get through stage 3 administrability, but those are looking good so far. In addition, 3 exclusions have been granted. That would be single speed bikes imported under a different tariff heading than the ones I just noted. Carbon bike frames that are valued at less than $600. And then also, bicycle computers. And it's actually a limited subset of wired bike computers. It has some specific criteria you need to be able to meet to be eligible for that exclusion. Exclusion requests have been denied for e-bikes, e-bike motors, 20-inch kids bikes, and bicycle storage racks. And if you're wondering about where to get more information about all these, you can go to exclusions.ustr.gov. You can search the whole docket to see what exclusion requests have been filed. It's searchable by product name, by who filed it, by what the import code is for that product. So there's a number of ways to look at that information. So that's a great place to look if you want more, want to know more. If you have imports that you think might be covered by one of these exclusions that have been granted, you actually need to look in a slightly different location. Whether or not, let me rephrase that, the scope of the exclusion is determined by language that's published by the US Trade Representative's Office in the Federal Register. So for each of these products for which an exclusion has been granted, there is a specific line in a Federal Register posting for that product. And that will be the language that determines whether your import, if it meets that description, is then eligible for the exclusion. When exclusions are granted, they are not company specific. If you are an importer of that product as described in the exclusion that's been granted, you are eligible. So just because you didn't apply, that doesn't mean you still can't take advantage of an exclusion that's been issued by the Trade Representative's Office. So if you do import those products, you should really take a hard look at whether you may be able to receive some tariff relief for those goods. So that was round 3. The round 4A exclusion process is currently open. The deadline to apply for those goods is January 31, 2021. And we'll certainly be filing some exclusion requests related to those products. We'll definitely be participating to either work with some companies to file one for helmets, if not filing one ourselves. But then there's also a number of other products on there that could be very good candidates for exclusions as well. Again, that's the round that included things like shifters, derailleurs, stems, seat post, handlebars, wheels. So there's still some time to assess, if you're an importer of those products, whether you might want to apply for an exclusion for those goods. Status of trade talks. Very hard to get a good read on what's happening in this space, honestly. You've probably seen the media has had a lot of mixed messaging about what's going on. I think that's because each side is actually trying to use the media to their advantage by making statements about sort of what they think has been agreed to try and kind of leverage those talks. So you'll hear the Chinese officials frequently say the tariffs are going to be rolled back. Then Trump kind of says, oh, no, I haven't agreed to anything yet. You know, I think they're both trying to just leverage the media as much as they can as part of the negotiation tactics. That being said, I'd say most businesses and most politicians in Congress are still optimistic about a near-term deal being made through these current negotiations. Obviously, that won't resolve the whole trade conflict, but it would certainly be a start. And you know, this phase one deal, as it's been called, is definitely realistic. I think the biggest issue for our industry is whether we'll include a rollback of some tariffs. There are other issues that the U.S. is really pushing China to resolve first, and these are purchases of U.S. agricultural goods, intellectual property concerns, and forced technology transfers from U.S. companies doing business in China. That is really what the U.S. is focusing on right now. And this rollback of tariff issues is very much an open question. Obviously, we'd like to see that, but truthfully, I can't give you a good assessment of whether that's going to happen or not. That wraps up Section 301 tariffs on goods imported from China. I'm going to turn over to the Miscellaneous Tariffs Bill, talk about the process, previous cycles, and what we're looking at for 2019 petitions. So the Miscellaneous Tariffs Bill is a really interesting sort of quirk of tariff policy. Historically, what has happened is that Congress has passed individual pieces of legislation to grant different products some form of tariff relief if there is not a domestic industry for that product. What essentially happened was Congress got criticized for the manner in which it was doing this, which was kind of behind closed doors, not very open, and is similar to sort of an earmark criticism. They were really criticized for having industry capture the process, working for constituents in their district, but maybe ignoring those in others, these types of things. And they decided in 2015 to revamp the process to make it a little more transparent for everybody. And so there'd be kind of common criteria that would be used to evaluate whether tariff relief should be received. So what they did was they used the International Trade Commission as an agency to vet these different products to see whether they would be eligible for miscellaneous tariffs bill relief before they got to Congress. And so the example I have here is this year's cycle of how that process will be undertaken. It's been done once before in 2016, but essentially what happens is companies petition the International Trade Commission for their product to receive tariff relief. ITC analyzes the petition, ITC submits a report to Congress, and then Congress introduces a bill that actually provides the tariff relief. So that ITC report doesn't have a legal effect. Congress needs to pass legislation that actually provides tariff relief. So this year, the deadline to apply is December 10th. So there's about 3 weeks left. And Congress will ideally be looking at passing a bill in fall 2020. That may or may not happen. You know, I have a slightly more pessimistic timeline on here going into late 2020, maybe even 2021. It kind of depends on what else they're dealing with at that time. But the most optimistic view, if things move in a pretty orderly way, would be that Congress is looking at passing legislation in fall 2020. Again, that could be prolonged. So when you apply to ITC, there are a number of factors that they consider in your petition. And the key first one is whether there's domestic production. This is really a program that is intended to provide tariff relief for products that we do not make domestically. The ITC also tends to view favorably products that are inputs to other products we assemble or make here in some capacity. So if you have inputs that you import, those can be excellent candidates for the miscellaneous tariff bill petition. Also, the financial effect of the tariff reduction has to be less than $500. Now, this doesn't mean that if your total tariff burden for a product line exceeds $500,000, you can't apply. It's just that the tariff reduction that will be made available to you is going to cap out at $500,000. So let's say there was a 5% tariff on a product, and all the tariffs cumulatively paid by everyone for that product who was importing it were $300,000. You could, of course, wipe out the entire tariff and send it to zero. Let's say the total tariff being paid for a particular product was $1 million. The max you'd be able to do would be able to cut the tariff in half and reduce that tariff burden from $1 million to $500,000. So don't let that dollar figure dissuade you. It's more of a limitation on how much tariff relief you can achieve through this process, as opposed to a black and white rule that's going to kick your good out of eligibility. And the last thing is administrability. We talked about this before with the Section 301 tariffs, and that's, again, the customs needs to be able to identify what the product is without having a whole bunch of extra information. You know, ideally, these are observable or physical characteristics. So in 2016 was the last time we went through this process. The bike industry applied for relief for several products. I should say what really happens is a company in the bike industry applies, or if we're kind of putting our heads together, one is sort of chosen as a designated company to be the petitioner. And relief was granted for a few different products. Disc brakes received a reduction in the tariff from about 10% to 7.5%. And then a bunch of other tariffs were essentially wiped out. So speedometers, reflectors, unicycles, sea cages, and water bottle lids. Petitions were filed but rejected for wheel rims and child carriers. And these were rejected due to objections from a domestic producer. So that just goes to underscore how important the concept of domestic production is when you're thinking about this form of tariff relief. If there is any noteworthy domestic manufacturing of that product, that's not going to be good for your petition. And ITC will contact those companies to ask them if they have a position on the petition. And if they object to the petition, that's typically a fatal blow. So you really need to be thoughtful about thinking about the domestic manufacturing for the product and whether you really have a legitimate case to be made for it. And know that not only will you be asked to identify domestic producers of the product on your petition, but ITC will be contacting them and asking for their input. So for 2019, we're thinking about expanding what we are petitioning for. Obviously, we're going to do the products that have previously been granted relief under this, because I don't think anything has changed in terms of the domestic production of any of those goods. But there are some other ones where either these line items or perhaps subsets of these line items don't have a significant domestic production, and they could be viable candidates. This is certainly subject to change as we get closer to this December 10th deadline. And when I say subsets of these line items, it may be that, you know, only carbon fiber bicycle frames valued at less than $600 are a viable candidate that we could really think of pursuing as a potential miscellaneous tariffs bill petition, because most of the carbon manufacturing, there's not a lot of it in the US, and it's typically higher end. So those are the kind of factors that will go into consideration. You know, and if domestic production is a roadblock, then it won't be submitted. So that's sort of where our head's at currently. If you think you have other ideas, I'd certainly love to hear them from you. Or if you are aware of domestic production of these products that perhaps I am not aware of, I'd love to hear about that. That wraps up the miscellaneous tariffs bill. I'm going to talk briefly about tariffs on cassettes and hubs from the EU, provide some background, talk about what was at stake and what happened. So essentially, there was a conflict that ended up going through the World Trade Organization in sort of a quasi-litigation capacity about the EU providing subsidies to Airbus at the expense of Boeing. So that was the source of this entire conflict. And the threat of the tariffs was a sanction for those actions. So tariffs on bike products really had nothing to do with the underlying conflict. They were kind of dragged into this as just a pure economic sanction that was a potential for the result of this issue if the US had success. So what was at stake? The US considered imposing a 25% increase on a whole bunch of different products that were identified by their 8-digit tariff headings. And this included 4 tariff headings that were relevant to hubs and cassettes. So at the 25% tariff rate, this would have been a potential $2.2 million tariff burden. So a decent amount of money at stake. I should note that initially that 25% rate wasn't sort of set in stone. The US was considering a rate as high as 100% at one point. So the tariff burden would have been, $8.8 million potentially if they had gone through with that higher number, but that wasn't what happened. Ultimately, this case played out in the World Trade Organization's tribunals. The U.S. was successful. We could have imposed tariffs unilaterally, but that was certainly better optics to have success at the World Trade Organization and legitimize what the U.S. was interested in doing here as a sanction. And after that, tribunal found that the EU had acted improperly in providing these subsidies to Airbus and that sanctions were appropriate. The U.S. moved forward with them. But what happened? This was really an administrative process here that was conducted through the Office of the United States Trade Representative again. There were hearings, there were legal briefs filed, all these sorts of things. But the key results was that our bike products were excluded from the final list of goods that were subject to a sanction. So engagement, I think, was really important in terms of making sure that we didn't get hit with additional tariffs, especially when we had nothing to do with the underlying dispute. And it was a nice win for the industry. Lastly, the Japan-US trade agreement. You may have seen this on the news. A new trade agreement between the US and Japan was reached in early October. Basically, what's going to happen here is over a period of 2 years following ratification, tariffs will be phased out on a number of different bike products that are imported to the US from Japan. Over the course of these 2 years, it's going to move in phases. So, once the deal is ratified, the tariff will be lowered a little bit, and then ultimately will either be reduced by 50%, as I've noted here, or eliminated. So you can see the product categories for which the tariff will be halved by the time we get to that 2-year post-ratification timeframe, and then tariffs will be eliminated on these goods outlined below. You'll probably notice, if you have a deep understanding of the harmonized tariff schedule, there's a number of goods that have harmonized tariff schedule headings that aren't listed here. So what happened to those? The tariff on all of those headings is already 0 for imports from all countries. So there was no need to identify them in the trade agreement and phase them out since they were already 0. So these are essentially all the categories of bike products that face some kind of tariff that is greater than 0. And then what will happen to them in terms of the tariff relief once the deal is ratified. Japan is still in the process of ratifying the deal. The effective date could come as early as January 2020. It's not totally clear. But we'll obviously be following that process and posting updates once we know for certain whether or what the official effective date is going to be. So what can you do to help mitigate your tariff risk if you're an importer of these products? Definitely know your upcoming opportunities relief and deadlines. So I've highlighted a few already. December 10th, 2019, miscellaneous tariffs bill petitions are due. January 31, 2020 is the deadline to file exclusions for goods included on List 4A of the Section 301 tariffs. So if you import products from China, definitely pay attention to that to know if your goods are included in List 4A and if you think you have a good case to be made for an exclusion. And then definitely review your the existing Section 301 exclusions for carbon frames, single speeds, and computers. You may be entitled to avoid future Section 301 tariffs if you import a product that is covered by those exclusions. And also you can receive an reimbursement for tariffs that you've already paid. So there's a retroactive effect to those Section 301 exclusions, and you can apply to get your money back as well. And then finally, make your voice heard. If tariffs are having a really significant and negative impact on your business, make sure you're engaging in our action alerts and telling members of Congress or administrative officials your story and what's happening with your business, how you're dealing with the tariffs. If you had to cut costs elsewhere, have you had to let employees go as a result of these? This is important information for our elected officials and also agency officials to be aware of as they're working through this process. So thank you. I'm going to go through some questions that our people have typed into the control panel here. If you have questions, keep bringing them in. I know I pushed that pretty close to our 1:30 deadline, so I'm happy to hang out on the line for a little while here and answer as many questions as we can get through. But I'll just get started. So one question is, what do we expect to happen in terms of pricing if the tariffs are lifted? Great question. I think this will depend a lot on what's going on with the operations of each manufacturer. You know, I think ideally we'd like to see market norms kind of restored. In the post-tariff world, we have kind of an artificial, in some sense, price increase that the tariffs are imposing in these goods as they come into the US. Ideally, everybody would get some relief as if those are to disappear and the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese imports are lifted. But obviously, that decision will be up to the manufacturers. I would think there'd certainly be general economic pressure for everybody. You know, low price is obviously a really important factor for all customers to consider. So you may not be able to get away with charging a higher price for no reason if you aren't paying for that input. But completely remains to be seen, and something that'll be on the maker level. Will we send this presentation out? Yes, we we'll also have a recording of the presentation, and we'll have the slides available. I'll let Eric touch on that at the end once I go through a few more questions. But yeah, we will be able to send this out and or post it on our website. What is the HTS code for electric bikes? I don't have the digits in front of me. I apologize, but it is not in the general bicycle category. So most of our bike products are imported under the 4-digit HTS headings that start with 8712 or 8714. And actually the one for e-bikes is in the motorcycle category because it has a motor, and that's how the harmonized tariff schedule classifies e-bikes. And that is actually 87116000. And then within that 8-digit code, there's 2 additional breakdowns depending on the wattage of the motor. And that's whether it has 250 watts or an output that is 250 watts or greater. Important to note that that category is not just e-bikes. It's basically any cycle with an electric motor. So it actually includes a whole bunch of different things. It includes electric motorcycles. It includes electric scooters, all sorts of different things. Any action on helmet tariff relief? So there's no updates in terms of what's happening right at this moment, but I think our best bet to get relief is with the 4A, round 4A exclusion process. Helmets are really interesting in that they were initially included in round 3 of the tariffs. We lobbied very aggressively to have them removed along with several helmet manufacturers. And they were removed from round 3, and then they were put back on round 4A for reasons that no one has ever been able to explain to us. So we'll absolutely be pursuing that aggressively in the round 4A exclusion process. I think it's probably one of the more compelling items to make a case for. We make suspension seat post. Are we under the seat post category in section 4A? You I make this statement having not reviewed this issue based on tariff rulings that may apply to suspension seat post, but yes, I believe that is the case. I would encourage you to verify that. But I think the most likely outcome is that those are imported under the miscellaneous category. That is 87, this is the HTS heading, 87149980. Again, not a 100% certain answer, but I believe that's likely. Question on the exclusion application for cruiser bikes that has moved from stage 2 to stage 3. And the question is, what's the criteria? So as this exclusion request was filed, it identified bikes that were imported under the same heading that applies to road bikes. So essentially, this is a section of the harmonized tariff schedule that applies to bikes with narrow tires and that meet certain weight requirements. I don't know exactly what criteria might be required if this advances to the point where it's published as an official exclusion. What happens is USTR and Customs go through and review these applications, and they publish a final description in the Federal Register that determines the scope of the exclusion. It's possible the applicant proposed some language for that in their application. We can't see that in the public docket, unfortunately, so I don't know what that looks like. It's also possible that Customs and USTR will change that description. Maybe they don't like that description. Maybe one wasn't provided. So it's a little bit of a waiting game there to see what the final description of the product is if the exclusion is granted. And once it's published, I'd be kind of surprised if it used a word like cruiser, because that's not very administrable. I would think they might use more objective criteria like wheel size, weight, frame material, things of that nature that were included in the application, but we have to wait and see. So those are things to keep an eye on. A question on a question from a company that looks like they assemble a product in the U.S. using imported parts, and the parts were hit by the tariff. And can you fight that? Absolutely. I think that's one of the most compelling cases for you to think about filing an exclusion request. I'm assuming this is a question related to the Section 301 tariffs. So if you have imported parts that come from China, and you're using those in assembly operations domestically, that's definitely information that is going to look really favorable on your application. So I would encourage you to consider, if you still have time for round 4A, to examine whether you can file exclusion requests for each of those inputs that you use, and then highlight the information of what your operations are in the US in terms of assembly, how many people you employ doing that, what the process looks like. Those are going to be factors that are good for your petition potentially. And then another question that was similar to the last one on the exclusion request for cruiser bikes, but in this case on single speeds, what are the criteria? Same answer. It's going to depend on what's published in the final publication if that exclusion request is granted. So we'll have to wait and see. All right, those are all the questions that I see. I think I've covered everything that people asked. If not, my contact information is here. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Let me know what's going on. And I think I'll turn it back over to Eric Bredell to close things out.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. That was a really awesome presentation and covered a lot of topics. So I'm sure that everybody's going to want to rewatch this again at some point. We'll have this sent out to everybody by this afternoon with a PDF copy of the slide deck, as well as a recording of the webinar. I want to take a brief moment to thank everybody who's on the call. That's a coalition member of People for Bikes. Without your membership, we couldn't do this great work and have these resources for you all in the industry. So if you're not a member of People for Bikes, please do consider reaching out to me at ericb@peopleforbikes.org, and we'll get you set up with all the necessary materials. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.